writing. Ollie.
Great, thanks very much. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm a big Five Things fan. So yeah, delighted and honoured to have the chance to talk. So the book I picked, well, it's by one of the best-selling authors of all time that I'm pretty sure everyone will have heard of. But I don't know whether many people will have heard about this book, which is a bit of a different one, Stephen King. I've read a few of his books before, back in my teens, which is a quite a long time ago. And I was a big fan of the books at the time, but I haven't really read a lot of his back catalogue. To be honest, I'm one of those people that gets a bit distracted and hops from author to author and genre to genre, you know. So I haven't really kind of gone through anyone's back catalogue, to be honest. And I suppose, you know, Stephen King is such a good writer. I suppose special shout out to Shawshank Redemption, which I know he wrote, and I think is like one of the greatest movies of all time, but I've never read the book. But if it's as good as a movie, it must be very good. So anyway, on writing, if we go to the next slide, this is a book about a writing masterclass sandwiched in a memoir, is how I've sort of described it. And it starts with this fabulous memoir looking back at his early life, and it's really fantastic. I mean, it's properly laugh out loud. And he's got a wicked sense of humour, and he's obviously such a good writer, and he can just articulate any situation so well. Excuse me. But today, for my 5 things, I'm just going to focus on the masterclass bit, which is a bit in the middle. So I suppose I wanted to read this book for a while, because personally, I'm someone that likes and enjoys the act of writing, but I mainly write emails, documents, presentations, blog posts, and I do wonder, you know, do these count as writing? And I'm not sure in King's world they do, but I suppose if you try and craft these things in some way, then I suppose they are, you know, that is the craft of writing, isn't it? Excuse me. Now, I didn't really read this book because, you know, I wanted to write a novel or short stories and become an author, although I suppose like many people, maybe some of you here, kind of like the idea of that. But to be honest, I don't think I've got the patience, or never mind the talent. But excuse me, early morning. I was going to take a drink of water. So I just thought it'd be an interesting read, and it really is. And I think maybe just a little bit, it's maybe made me a better writer. So if we kind of press on with the first takeaway, one second. Not COVID, sorry. Right, the first thing, if you want to be a writer, you must do 2 things above all others: read a lot and write a lot. And I think writing a lot is probably pretty obvious, isn't it? I mean, it's not really possible to get good at anything unless you practice and put in your 10,000 hours. But the read a lot part isn't so obvious, at least it wasn't to me. And King says he reads 70 or 80 books a year, mostly fiction, and he calls himself a slow reader, which I thought was quite funny because he clearly hasn't met me. You know, I'm trying to read 25 books a year according to my Goodreads challenge, and I'm on track, but it's a bit of a slog. But anyway, I was quite proud of 25. But anyway, but clearly he devours books, and he always has a book on him wherever he is. So if he's excuse me, standing in line at the ball game, he's reading, but he says he doesn't do this to study the craft. He does it because, as he says, and I like to read, I like stories, and if you don't have time to read, you don't have the time or the tools to write, because reading is the creative center of a writer's life. So I really like that. And you know, if you want to be a novelist like him, well, he has a strict reading and writing program, 4 to 6 hours a day, which, you know, if you really enjoy it and have an aptitude for it, then that won't seem too strenuous. So that's how much he does. And he says he's a slow reader, but he also says he's a slow writer. He doesn't think he's prolific, even though he's written 35 books. But then he talks about John Creasy, who's a novelist I've never heard of, apparently wrote 500 books under 10 different names. Then he does question people like Harper Lee. What do they do with the rest of their time? It's like written, well, at the time he wrote this, 1 book. So anyway, for me, the key takeaway from this point is, really to try and read more books, which basically, well, for me, translates as look at my phone less, I think. So that's what I would say. So on to number 2. This one's common tools go on the top of your toolbox. And so this is an analogy about the toolbox. And if you have an actual toolbox at home, you keep the most common ones at the top, your screwdriver or your Allen key, or whatever. And a writer has their own toolbox, and the most common tool of all, which Stephen King calls the bread of writing, is vocabulary, and that should be at the top of your toolbox. And kind of crucially, you shouldn't make any conscious effort to improve your vocabulary. You don't dress it up looking, for long words because you're ashamed of the small ones. And as he says, and to quote, "This is like dressing up a household pet in evening clothes. The pet is embarrassed, and the person who committed this act of premeditated cuteness should be even more embarrassed." So use the first word that comes into your mind if it's appropriate. And he kind of goes on and says, if you hesitate and cogitate, you'll come up with another word. And of course you will, because there's always another word, but it probably won't be as good as the first one, or as close to what you actually mean. And I think that's really true, isn't it? People have, probably struggled, and looked at thesauruses and tried to improve. But to be honest, the one you pick first is probably the one you really mean. And I remember I once read a quote, and I can't remember who it was by or who said it. And it was something along the lines of, if you have to use a thesaurus, you've already lost. And I think that's kind of the same thing. And also it reminds me of that Stephen Wright joke, where he just stands there, "What's another word for thesaurus?" Quite like that one. So that's number 2. And number 3 is avoid the passive tense, where he kind of starts getting into grammar, which really isn't my strong point. And I don't know about you, but it doesn't really matter how many times I read or I'm told the rules of grammar, they just don't stay in my head. I don't really understand why, nouns and verbs, I get that, but then pronouns, and I get very confused. But anyway, the takeaway here is that there are 2 types of verbs, active and passive. And in active verbs, in the active voice, the subject is doing something, and with passive verbs, something is being done to the subject. And the passive voice, according to King, it's very safe. The subject is just letting it happen. You're kind of closing your eyes and thinking of England or Scotland, maybe, if that translates. So in the passive voice, you might say, "The meeting will be held at 7 o'clock." But in the active voice, you'd say, "The meeting's at 7, which is much better, right? And if you have 2 pages of the passive voice, which is like any business document ever written, it just makes you want to scream because it's really weak. So I think this is definitely a bit of a call to action to use the active voice in the business domain as well. And I think, it's definitely something I've tried to do without even really knowing it. It's just humanizing the writing is how I think of it. So avoid the passive voice. Number 4 is the road to hell is paved with adverbs, and the adverb is not your friend, according to Stephen King. So grammar rules obviously can't stay in my brain, but an adverb is a word that modifies a verb or an adjective or other adverbs, and they usually end in ly. And the problem with adverbs, according to Stephen King anyway, is when using them, the writer is telling us they're afraid they aren't expressing themselves clearly. So there's a couple of examples he has. For instance, "He closed the door firmly," and firmly being the adverb there. And so did he close the door, or did he slam the door? Firmly, the adverb is redundant. You don't need it. Or another example, if you said, "Put it down," she shouted, or "Put it down," she shouted menacingly. It's weaker, right? There's more impact in the first one. So yeah, adverb tells me, and he, like another analogy, I mean, he's so good. He basically said adverbs are like dandelions, like one on its own can look really pretty and unique, but if you don't root it out, you'll find there's like 5 the next day, and then there's 50, and then you'll see them for what they really are, weeds, which I really like. So on to number 5. which is plot doesn't matter, which I thought was quite a controversial one and a bit of an eye-opener, because I always thought, having never written a book, I always thought authors planned their books meticulously, like J.K. Rowling having known the entire 7-book saga from the beginning. And maybe she did, but according to King, a strong enough situation renders the whole question of a plot moot. And the most interesting situations can usually be expressed as what if questions. So, for example, what if vampires invaded a small New England village? And that's the premise of Salem's Lot. Or what if a novelist has an accident and is rescued by a deranged fan? And that's Misery. And it's all about situation. So you pick your situation and you just go from there. And story is, as he says, is honorable and trustworthy. And plot is shifty and best kept under house arrest. So I thought that was really good. And so that's it. Those are my 5 things. And so to summarize, if you want to be a writer, you do 2 things with others: read a lot and write a lot. Common tools go at the top of your toolbox, and vocabulary is your most common one. Avoid the passive tense. The road to hell is paved with adverbs, and plot doesn't matter. So yeah, I highly recommend this book. It's very good. So yeah, go ahead and read it, and yeah, read more and write more.
Thanks, Ollie. Read more, write more, 100%. So you managed to distill the main points so succinctly. Or